most of my work focuses, I guess, on sort of three kinds of issues. Issues in ethics, especially issues in ethics that have to do with the relationship of individuals to sort of large scale social processes. And I think veganism is one example of that, or one example of an issue that sort of where that's a big part of the dynamic. And then I'm really interested in kind of methodological questions in ethics and more generally kind of foundational questions, what philosophers like to call questions in metaethics about like what are we even doing when we make ethical claims, things like this. So those are kind of the really big themes in the things that I spend all my time thinking hard about. And I really look forward to talking about some of the fantastic questions you all have today.
All right. Well, fantastic. So I guess to kind of set the tone, because yesterday we did a reading on stage of your paper titled "Why I'm Vegan and You Should Be Too." So I was wondering, would you just be able to like sort of lay out the basic argument there, just so that anyone who did not read it will be able to follow along with some of the questions?
Sure. So this is going to be, I'm going to skip over a lot of detail, obviously. Um, the basic form of the argument in that paper is something like this. Um, first, first question, how should we think about um, causing animals to suffer? And the first argument that I make is that there's a reason to think that we shouldn't be causing animals to suffer, that other things being equal, it's wrong to make non-human animals suffer. And the basic reason for that is that suffering is kind of this state that is, other things being equal, not to be inflicted. There's sort of, you don't need anything else to get that explanation up and running. And what I claim in the paper is that that seems like part of the best explanation for a bunch of judgments that we're very confident about. The second thing that I claim is that it's, other things being equal, again, wrong to kill non-human animals. And there again, I make a distinctive kind of argument. I claim that one thing that's usually a sufficient explanation for why it's wrong to kill an entity is that that entity has a future that's going to be valuable for that entity to have. And by killing them, you're going to deprive them of that future. And I explain the virtues of this account as an account of why it's wrong to kill, especially by appeal to weird cases where you can extend somebody's life while at the same time killing them. And so those of you who are connoisseurs, we can talk about those kinds of cases if you'd like. So putting those things together, you get an argument for the wrongness of causing suffering to and killing non-human animals. And what I then claim is if you look at the way that most of the animal products that we consume, or some of us consume, are produced, they're produced in contexts which at a very massive scale, we're talking about billions and billions and billions of animals, inflict a lot of suffering that is otherwise avoidable and a lot of early death on these animals. And so what you have is a kind of institutional structure that is engaging in wrongful behavior at a very large scale if the argument of the first part of the paper is incorrect. And then the last part of the paper is really an attempt to connect the behavior of the individual as someone who's trying to think about, should I be a vegan, for example, to that scenario. And I claim that in general, you have reasons not to be complicit with institutions that are inflicting that kind of suffering and that kind of early death, in general, that kind of wrongful behavior. And that by consuming animal products, you are, in effect, engaging in a form of wrongful complicity. That's what I say in that paper. I'm inclined these days to sort of make make some adjustments to the things I say in the last part of the paper. But that's sort of very broadly the story I tell in the paper. And then one thing that I should probably say is that part of what I say in the paper is that the argument is sort of cautious in some respects. So it's compatible, the argument that I make, with the thought that there are going to be some contexts in which it's okay to consume products made from non-human animals. It's just that, like, so the claim is that veganism is a kind of moral requirement in a similar way that keeping your promises is a moral requirement. Sometimes there can be other considerations that outweigh the duty to keep a promise, but that doesn't mean it's not a pretty central and weighty ethical consideration. So there's lots more that I could say, but that's kind of the very big picture, and so maybe I'll just pause there.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. So I'm glad you mentioned that you might tweak some things about the last bit. So first question, it's a question from yours truly. So I was watching, I don't know if you've heard of the show The Bear on Hulu, but it's a very popular show. And essentially it's about this guy who works in a kitchen, and he like works at a fine dining restaurant and now works in a kitchen. Anyways, food is like a main part of the show. And all the products are pretty much non-vegan. So it's a very good show, and I benefited from watching it. Would this constitute benefiting from wrongdoing? And do I have just as much reason to not watch the show as I would to refrain from animal products?
So this is a great question. So I actually think it's a little bit tricky what to say about this. So I'll say a few things, and I think I'm going to start by saying things. I think everything I'm going to say to start with is kind of just compatible with the stuff that I say towards the end of the paper. So first of all, one thing that I say in the paper that maybe doesn't pop out enough when I'm talking about complicity is the complicity principle isn't just a principle about benefiting from wrongdoing. So just to give an example, like there's lots and lots of scientific research that has been done in unethical ways in various ways. And I think that anybody who then, builds on the knowledge that has been acquired in those problematic ways is in a sense benefiting from that wrongdoing. Part of the idea of complicity is that you are sort of part of a feedback mechanism, which is sort of helping, perhaps not in a decisive way, but helping to actually support the people who are doing the wrongful things. Imagine that, like, the fact that the documentary is happening doesn't benefit the people who are running the restaurant in a particular way. In that kind of case, it seems to me you might be benefiting by learning various things by watching the documentary, but you're not complicit with the wrongdoing in the restaurant in the way that I describe in the paper. Whereas if like the the Hulu show is like part of what makes it economically feasible and sustainable for the restaurant to do what it does, or it makes those people like rich in virtue of the way that they've been using lots of animal products, that might be more of something that would fit into sort of slot into the account that I'm describing. So that's a kind of subtle distinction, but the sort of question is like, one sort of way to think of a kind of slogan in that last part of that paper is like, are you supporting the wrongdoers in their wrongdoing? Right? And so, for example, if you were just like watching someone who was eating a cheeseburger and like learning something about human gustatory habits, they're not benefiting from you watching them. That wouldn't be a case of complicity in the relevant sense. On the other hand, if you're like going and like, okay, like I'll give you $100 to eat this cheeseburger so I can watch you, like then it looks like we're more into sort of a problematic situation. And so it seems to me like this might be a case where depending on the details, it might wind up kind of going either way.
Gotcha. So I should clarify, the show is not a documentary, it's completely fictional.
Okay.
And yeah, basically it's completely fictional, and they just buy a whole bunch of meat and cook it and everything. And actually I mentioned this to Tyler Doggett, who we've talked to. He's done an AMA here, and he said he reminded me that pretty much every show that has ever existed, at least on set, I guess, fed people non-vegan food all the time. And so, it would seem that every show was produced by some sort of there was some sort of immorality involved in its creation or
Yeah.
whatever. And I was wondering what you think about that, and would we have a reason to avoid all shows, or like that's too demanding, and why is it too demanding?
Good. So I talk a little bit about this at the end of the paper. I think there's actually some pretty deep questions about ethics more generally that sort of start coming out. One of the things that actually sort of bothers me a little bit about uh, normative ethics as it's done in the academy, in philosophy departments, in, say, North America, is that in general, there's often this kind of feeling like we're engaged in kind of ethical evaluation of wrongdoing against a kind of background that, like, everything's pretty much okay, right? And one of the things that I talk about briefly at the end of this paper is, like, I think there's a really worth taking seriously alternative picture of our scenario where, like, wrongdoing is endemic. It's everywhere. And, like, if you're a vegan, that's going to be a very, very plausible thought. And then you have this sort of tricky situation where, like, are you never going to consume a cultural product where the consumption of animal products played a role in the production of that cultural product? Well, then you're like, there's going to be a very small number of cultural products that are going to be available to you. There might be some, but then, like, suppose you're looking at, like, only cultural products produced by vegans. Well, like, what kind of technology are they using to produce those cultural products, right? I'm talking to you. I've got a laptop here and a microphone, and I would be shocked if those products were not produced in ways that involved unfair, unjust labor practices, right? And so one thing that you might think, and this is something that some people have pressed me on in the context of this paper, is like, look, we're like, if you had that view, you might think, look, we're just always sort of, elbow deep in complicity with wrongful activity. And so, like, why are you picking on this one thing, right? So I think this is actually, that you might be a vegan who's sort of less worried about other aspects of our world than I am. And so you might be able to sort of reject that line of argument. But I at least take it pretty seriously. And one of the things that I say that I think is sort of right is that the fact that you can't avoid wrongdoing at all, you can't sort of avoid any complicity, like, you can't, as it were, have perfectly clean hands, as if that was what matters, doesn't mean that you don't have reasons to avoid complicity in particular cases. So that's, and one of the things I think about veganism that's important is that there's this respect in which we really do have control over whether we're involved in this sort of pretty direct and central way in this very problematic structure. And I think that's a cut that strikes me as potentially ethically significant. I do think it's a way of pushing back. You might say, as I think some of the other people you've had on to do AMAs are more inclined to say, like, look, there's bad stuff going on, and maybe you got to choose your battles, and maybe you choose your battles in a way that still involves eating a cheeseburger. I'm sort of suspicious about that, just because I think that you can live a perfectly excellent life being a vegan. It's kind of less clear that you can live a perfectly excellent life, like, never like engaging with entertainment, never reading a book, right? Never using a computer. And so I'm inclined to try to make a cut that way about, like, what are plausible, what's available to us as lives which we can live, we can sort of live a life that is an excellent life, and at the same time, like, make some of these cuts in terms of what we're going to be complicit with and what we're not.
Okay, that's
that was a little complicated. I apologize.
No, that was exactly what I was looking for. All right, and then I think you're probably gonna have a similar answer to this, but someone says similar to the theme of the question I just asked. Anyone who has a 401k retirement account that holds a mutual fund, or anyone who invests in an index fund or owns an exchange traded fund (ETF) for their retirement plan is an investor in companies that profit off exploiting animals. The basic principle of index funds or exchange trade funds is diversification and holding for the long term. The stocks of many companies in a lot of sectors. It's not active trading, but holding stocks for a lot of years until retirement. An ETF most likely has its collection of stocks, the stock of companies like Nike and McDonald's. How could an ethical vegan who wants to have a retirement plan resolve the ethical conflict of indirectly investing in companies that profit from animal exploitation and suffering?
Okay, yeah, so that is a great practical question. And so I'll say, so I think part of what I'm inclined to say is something similar to what I just said, which is like, what you're looking for is there a cut that I can make that is a kind of ethically sustainable cut? And I think it's potentially going to vary from person to person, right? One of the ways it might vary is like, how savvy of an investor are you? So I think that if you were prepared to put in the kind of time and energy that I've put into sort of thinking about food, and thinking about my own diet and lifestyle around those things into what you're investing in, then I think you would probably be able to create a wonderful diversified portfolio of companies that, at least with respect to veganism, are going to be not sort of the sort of main offenders. You're not going to have any sort of McDonald's in there. But again, this intersects with the point that I was making in response to the last question. If you're like, yeah, okay, but what about labor practices? Well, now that's a much different range of companies, right? Now, like, how about climate change? How are these companies doing with respect to climate change?
Right,
That
right.
again might be right. And so, if you might work yourself into thinking like, again, are you ever going to be able to invest in a diversified portfolio that makes you feel like you aren't in any way complicit with evil? Probably not. Are there sort of strategies out there that you can identify that would, as it were, be a conscientious way of mitigating that? I think there probably are. There are various kinds of sort of socially conscious investing sort of resources out there. There are people who attempt to produce sort of mutual funds, et cetera, which are ethical in various respects. I mean, as with sort of the phenomenon of greenwashing, there's always like a real worry about how like deep these things go. But I think there are resources out there, and I think you can do better. But I think one of the things that this sort of brings out, this is something that, like, just speaking personally for myself, I definitely don't spend that kind of energy thinking about what it would take to educate myself about this. And I have some broadly index based mutual funds in my, that's probably the center of my investment portfolio, right? And so I am definitely doing the kind of thing that this questioner is concerned about.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm tempted to think that I should be doing better.
All right. Okay, well, thanks so much. Next question, Ditamic asks, what is your opinion on modern day SeaWorld, in parentheses, based on conservation of animals and roller coasters? Would you say they've improved?
This, I think, might be outside of my area of expertise. I
All
don't
right.
know enough about what exactly is going on
Mhm.
in the contemporary world of SeaWorld. In general, I think that when you think about zoos, just more generally,
Mhm.
I think there is a very substantive ethical question, because many contemporary zoos will talk about their mission in significant part in terms of some kind of conservation mission. And I think that it's possible that there are particular cases where that, in fact, is important enough work that couldn't be done in other ways to justify the work of those zoos. But I think in a very wide range of cases, this really is an instance of something like greenwashing. It's like this is the like window dressing, the ethical window dressing over a business whose business plan is to make money by displaying animals in circumstances that aren't good for those animals for the enjoyment of the public.
Right. All right. Well, thanks so much. So, next question from Peach. Hi, just wanted to know your opinion on the doctrine of double effect when it comes to crop deaths. I guess getting at the intended harm versus
So maybe I'll say a little bit about just for everybody else in the audience,
right?
A little bit about the classical doctrine of double effect, and then how it might. The term was crop deaths. Was that what the
yeah. So
I think I can reconstruct the kind of case that is in mind. Okay, so first of all, here's the kind of case, just to start with something that will be of interest to a wider range of people. Here's the kind of worry that some people have about the original paper that I know of that makes this kind of point is, I think, a paper by somebody named Stephen Davis. So the worry is this, well, suppose that you're a vegetarian or a vegan because you care about the lives of non-human animals and those lives being sacrificed in the production of your food products. Well, just think about what happens to non-human animals in the production of vegetables and grain, right? Think about how many field mice get killed in the thresher, etc., right? And the idea is it might actually be, if you're, as it were, like counting up sentient beings, it might be that like the number of field mice that get killed per calorie of wheat might be greater than the number of cows that get killed per calorie of beef, something like that, right? Okay, so that's kind of an initial challenge. Now, here's a kind of natural, I don't know how natural it is. Here's a kind of thought that you might have in response to that, which is, look, there's a difference between intentionally raising and fattening up a cow and then slaughtering it and then selling that product, and threshing some grain where you can foresee that there are some field mice who live in that area who are probably going to get chewed up. The thought is there's this sort of important difference there, and that difference is a difference that might make an ethical difference. It might be objectionable to do the first thing. You sort of intend these evil outcomes to these non-human animals, where in the case of the field mice, the suffering and death of the non-human animals might be a foreseen but not intended side effect, what you're up to. Okay, so I just want to pause there. Do you think that's kind of set up the sort of scenario for everyone in a way that everyone can follow?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah, I think that's fantastic.
Awesome. Okay, I just wanted to check in because there's a lot of stuff there. So some philosophers, and this goes back to an ethical tradition that really developed within the kind of Catholic ethical tradition, have been interested in a doctrine that they call the Doctrine of Double Effect. And the idea is that sometimes, in general, it's not okay to bring about evil. It's not okay to bring about bad effects through your actions knowingly, right? But what they say is there's a difference, the very kind of difference that we were just describing, between kind of intentionally bringing about the bad effect as a means to your end and the bad effect merely being a foreseen side effect. And here's a kind of heuristic, right? Imagine all the field mice took a day off from the field while you were harvesting your wheat. You wouldn't be like, oh darn, I didn't get to kill a bunch of field mice, my plan isn't working. You'd be like, great, I got to get my wheat and I didn't kill a bunch of field mice, right? Whereas if you fattened up your cow and then you're about to slaughter them and they disappear, your plan as somebody who makes their money raising beef has been pretty seriously disrupted, right? So that's the idea. The idea is like it's a foreseen side effect, but it's not sort of essential to the plan that you have that the field mice die. And so the doctrine of double effect basically says it can be permissible to perform actions where you foresee that there's going to be evil outcomes if the good outcomes that you foresee are going to be much greater than the bad outcomes, and they're merely foreseen and not intended. So that's the principle. Okay. Now I'm going to say something pretty unsatisfying, which is things philosophically are really, really hard quite generally in this vicinity. I think that the doctrine of double effect, the principle of double effect, in this sort of simple form that I just stated it, is probably false. There are lots of interesting cases that look to me to create problems for it. There are smart philosophers who say, yeah, but you can tweak it a little bit, and then you get a principle that sort of saves what's plausible about it. I think that there's something very compelling about the idea that either this connection between what's intended and foreseen or something that's correlated with that does important ethical work. But this, I confess, is one of these questions in ethics that I find extremely hard, and I'm not sure what to say about it. Now, suppose, let me come back from like hardcore ethical theory philosophy for a moment, where I've sort of gestured at what I think, but I haven't sort of gone too far into the details, and come back to kind of the practical question. Like, I started the answer by saying, there's this challenge. You want to be a vegan or a vegetarian, but like, think of all the field mice that are going to get killed by the grain thresher, right? So I think that, again, part of the answer to this question is going to connect up to what can you do, what is within your control and what isn't within your control. It's going to be very hard to eat food products where there isn't some animal death somewhere in the genesis of those food products, right? And so then the question is, how should you think about veganism in that kind of context? Again, it's not going to be a matter of having clean hands. It's not going to be a matter of not in any way being connected to the death of non-human animals, because we just don't live in a world where that's really a feasible possibility. But maybe it can be a way of kind of mitigating that. And there, the numbers are going to matter a lot. So if it really is the case that calorie per calorie, your loaf of bread is causing, or is sort of involved in more animal death than your steak, then that's a real kind of challenge, where you're going to need to have something in the vicinity of double effect to support your argument. Maybe not double effect itself, but you're going to need to have something there. But again, the empirical parts of this are quite touchy, in large part because, guess what? If you're thinking about eating the steak, the beef in general is not just field grazed beef. They're being fed lots of grain, and that grain got harvested with a thresher. And so, you're likely, even if you're just interested in minimizing the amount of non-human animal death that goes into your diet, I'm guessing that veganism is probably still a part of your best strategy. Although you probably have to start really thinking about different kinds of food products and as it were, what the death profile of those different food products is to get a little bit grisly.
All right. Thanks so much. So next question from Reeve. Thoughts on ethical fruitarianism? Have you heard of that?
So I think I know what fruitarianism is, and I would assume that ethical fruitarianism is just the view that ethically one ought to be fruitarian. So what would motivate ethical fruitarianism, I take it, is the thought that if, for example, I pick an apple off an apple tree and I eat it, I am not killing the apple tree. Like the fruit is not a living being, a plant. It's just a kind of product produced by that plant.
And not
so
frustrating any of its processes.
Right. So you're not killing a plant by eating the fruit. I mean, there's a way in which you're interfering with. Okay, I'm going to speak very metaphorically here, right? Like, why is the plant producing fruit? Well, it wants to produce more plants of its kind. That's sort of what teleologically, that's what the process is there for, like functionally, if you like. And so you are kind of frustrating that process, although maybe if you like eat the fruit and then you plant the seeds or something, you're not doing that either. You're maybe even helping, because very often the reproductive strategy for, say, lots of berries is they get eaten by some bears and the bears poop out the seeds and then the seeds grow into more blackberries and everybody's happy, right? So I take it that's kind of the picture, and it seems to me that if there's a reason to favor this kind of view over a vegetarian view, setting aside the kind of complications about the deaths of non-human animals and the production of various kinds of vegetable foods that we've just been talking about, it's going to have to do with the thought that there's something bad about ending the life of a plant, for example. And I confess I'm just not convinced by that thought, that there's sort of a meaningful ethical objection to, pulling a plant out of the ground, and part of that has to do with the question of like, what explains why it's objectionable to perform actions that end the life of a living thing. And some people think, well, it's the life of a living thing and you've ended that life. But that strikes me as a very implausible answer for lots of reasons. Sometimes it strikes me as good to end the life of a living thing. For example, if it's a living thing that can suffer and it's suffering, very often it would be a mercy to find a way to painlessly end that living thing's life. And so in general, when I think about what would make it the case that I ought not to end the life of a living thing, usually I think that it's going to have to do with depriving the living thing of something that's valuable for that living thing from its point of view. And I just think, I don't think there's anything that it's like to be, say, a lettuce plant or a basil plant. I have a garden. I picked some basil leaves off the basil plant. I don't think that the basil plant suffered as a result. And because of that, my inclination is to think that I haven't done anything wrong with respect to the basil plant by picking off its leaves at lunchtime today. Because the basil plant is not the kind of thing that can suffer. It's not the kind of thing where the sort of functional fact that I have impeded its functioning to some small extent by taking off some of its leaves, that's not the kind of thing that strikes me as sort of explaining the kind of thing that can produce an ethical reason. Whereas the fact that I'm going to cause agony to a puppy, that does seem like the kind of thing that directly explains why I have a reason not to do that.
Gotcha. Side note, what did you have for lunch today?
We actually had brunch, and what did we have? I made a kind of warm salad with yellow squash and cherry tomatoes and some fresh basil. We had a kind of scrambled tofu dish, and then I made whole wheat waffles, which is like one of my central things. Gotten really good at making them.
Oh yeah,
so that's my brunch go-to.
Gotcha.
And I'm Canadian, so there's maple syrup involved. So
of course. I'm in Vermont, so I know the drill.
And then we had guests, and they brought over some fresh local peaches, which were pretty great.
Oh, amazing!
And had that. So that was brunch.
That sounds great. All right, and I'm just gonna jump around a little here. Just because it was already mentioned of the valuable future thing. So, Professor, are we depriving animals of a valuable future by not breeding them for, quote, humane agriculture? I.e., if there's a farm that will allow animals to live a nice life, let's say a net positive life, would it be wrong to not breed the animals for the same reasons it is typically wrong to kill animals, i.e., the depriving of valuable future?
Awesome. Yeah, so this is a great question. Um, in my view, in the first instance, the answer is no, it's not wrong. And I think that there's a really central kind of cut, which, if you don't want to think about non-human animals, we can just think about with people.
Right, I was going to
And but in both cases, I think is the same basic point. I don't think that I have. I think that if I was to choose to reproduce again and have another child, I think that child would almost certainly have an excellent life. I don't think I have any particular strong reasons to reproduce and have another child in virtue of that fact. On the other hand, I have an existing child, and I think I have very strong reasons to make sure that I don't do things which prevent that child who currently exists from having an excellent life. Mm-hmm. And so I really think, and this is something which matters a lot when we're thinking about questions about ethics and the future. I don't think there's any particular reason to think that we have ethical reasons to bring it about that there are more creatures existing who have good lives. But once a creature exists and has the potential for a good life, I think that if we then cut that short, that's a real problem. That's, in general, a way of wronging that creature. Other things being equal, again. So I think that contrast, I think, is really important. And I think you can just think about it intuitively. Imagine that I, choose to, if I imagine that I have a dog and I choose to breed the dog, and the dog has puppies, and the puppies have a great life for 3 years. But I do this whole thing because at the end of the 3 years, I want to painlessly kill them for an art installation I'm doing. I don't know why I always pick on art as the thing I might be doing with the dogs, but it seems to me like that's not okay, despite the fact that what I've done has produced good lives for those dogs. Because once they exist, it should be not okay for me to end their perfectly good lives in order to produce the art installation. And I don't think that I had any particular reason to make them exist in the first place. And the fact that I chose to make them exist doesn't, as it were, give me a get out of jail free card, ethically speaking, that makes it okay for me to then kill them anytime that I want.
Okay, so it has to be actually wronging some individual or moral patient, and then what grounds the fact that it's wronging then is going to be the deprivation of a valuable future.
Exactly.
Is that what I'm getting? All right, perfect. Thanks so much. Okay, coming from Oak. Hi, Professor. I was wondering your opinions on Dr. Temple Grandin, if any at all. And if you don't wish to answer that, a replacement question I have is, what do you think of dog shows? I feel like it exploits dogs for people's gains, but I want to know your thoughts on one or both. Thanks for your time.
Okay, so I think I probably could be better informed about both of these topics. So I think Temple Grandin's a really interesting person, but I feel like they're a person with a long and interesting career, and I feel like I have not, for example, kept up with they've been up to over the past 5 years or something. So I think I don't want to comment about the specifics of that case. There is something which I sort of associate with Temple Grandin, which is a kind of attempt to identify strategies to kind of work within the system of industrialized animal agriculture to produce changes that maybe mitigate the terror and suffering, especially at the end of life, for those animals in the context of slaughter. That's something which I associate with Temple Grandin. Is that something which, for example, you associate with Temple Grandin? Let me just ask you that question.
Me?
Yeah. Is that?
I did not previously know who Temple Grandin was until.
Okay, all right. So,
now.
Anyway, so imagine we're thinking about somebody like that. Somebody whose sort of work is to try to do that kind of mitigation work. Um, I think there are some really delicate ethical questions here. I'm inclined to think that that work is really important insofar as it's successful. That is, insofar as it mitigates the suffering that these non-human animals experience. I think that one thing that shouldn't confuse us about is that that doesn't then suddenly make like the treatment of those non-human animals okay. That we have sort of mitigated the suffering at the end of life stage. But that doesn't mean that like somebody who has spent a meaningful part of their career making those kind of changes, given the fact that we live in a world where like we're just not going to wake up tomorrow morning and everybody's going to be vegan and we're all going to treat the non-human animals super well. I think people who manage to find strategies to make really meaningful differences in the lives of very large numbers of non-human animals, I think that's a real win, despite the fact that I think ultimately we should be trying to go much further. So I think so that's the first thing on the kind of dog shows and exploitation. Again, I think I know even less about dog shows than I do about Temple Grandin. I think, but let me speak again. You're really learning, those of you who are not philosophers in the chat, you're learning what it's like to talk to a philosopher, because what I'm going to basically say is like, imagine dog shows are like this. I don't really know what dog shows are like. And now let me tell you what I think about that. And then if you want to tell me, no, dog shows are different, then, you know. So there are many things that might go on at dog shows. Like I can imagine, as with other kinds of events of this kind, like, are dog show participants routinely like subjected to painful surgeries, or like are they starved because this brings about some desirable thing? So I don't know any of those things, but imagine that really what goes on in dog shows is that the dogs themselves are not significantly harmed, but they're like, their owners, quote unquote, right, train them to do certain things and dress them, make them look all nice by the standards of what looks nice in a dog show, et cetera. And then they parade them around, et cetera. I guess my inclination is to say I have no objection to that, because I don't really think of dogs as creatures that can be wronged in that way. And this, I think, has to do with, again, one of the things I talk about in the paper, which is that I think like human beings have all these different kinds of ethically significant features. And so with non-human animals, I think many of the, there's much that we don't know about this sort of ethically significant features, especially around stuff about sociality and what makes for a good life for a non-human animal of a specific kind. Like some of those things I think we're still just trying to figure out. But I'm inclined to think that issues about exploitation of this kind, where the non-human animal isn't harmed in any direct way, they aren't made to suffer, etc., I'm inclined to think that seems to me to be not problematic in the way that it would be problematic when we think about, say, certain kind of pageants that involve children, where very similar sorts of things seem to me to be going on as with dog shows, except that it's like human children who are developing agents who are like basically being objectified in this super weird, unhealthy way. And I guess I'm inclined to think like, make a kind of like objectified aesthetic fetish out of a dog. I'm not sure you've wronged the dog by doing that if the dog is happy through the process. Do that to like an 11-year-old child, and I think you have wronged that child. And so that's I guess, where, because the child is supposed to be developing into sort of a human agent who's supposed to be understanding themselves and being understood by others as a full and equal member of society. Like that's, it seems to me, where the worry comes with the case of the humans. Okay, so I'll stop there, but that's roughly.
Yeah, that was a great, thorough response. I appreciate it. All right, so next, what are your thoughts on Freeganism and Josh Milburn / Bob Fischer's paper on Freeganism flouting dignity norms? Is flouting these norms more ethically weighty? And then part two of that. Is flouting these norms more ethically weighty than the foreseen crop deaths that may come from my consuming vegan products instead?
Yeah. So maybe you can remind me. It's been a while since I read this paper. Are the sort of dignity worries about the dignity of me as an agent as I'm like grubbing through the dumpster for some leftover chicken?
Oh no, of the dead animal, of how we treat the dead.
I see.
And
Okay.
they're basically taking the book expressed in the book Polis of including animals within our political community
Yep.
and saying that dignity norms regarding treatment post-mortem would apply.
Yeah.
It's specifically about meat, not animal
Okay.
product.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that's quite helpful. Yeah. So I think the kind of Zoopolis picture I think is very interesting. I think there's very delicate questions about what it means to include non-human animals in our political community. I definitely think that our political community should be structured in such a way that the interests of non-human animals are reliably and centrally represented. But I think that I'm quite, again, as with this sort of exploitation concern in the previous question, I want to make a distinction between kind of intrinsic and sort of extrinsic or indirect concerns about things like respect. So let me say what I mean by that. If I take a picture of you and I Photoshop it in such a way that it depicts you in a deeply humiliating way, one way of thinking about what I've done there, and suppose that I do that in the privacy of my hard drive and no one else ever sees the picture, and I just like I have some like weird psychological issue with you, and I create this Photoshop picture, and then I like feel great satisfaction looking at it. You might think that thing that I've done is disrespectful to you in this kind of intrinsic way. That is, I am relating to you as somebody to be treated contemptuously in my heart, if you like, right? But now I want to distinguish between that and suppose that I take that picture and I distribute it widely, successfully distribute it widely on the internet. Like it becomes the meme of the week, right? There, I might have all kinds of effects on your life. Your reputation, you might just like be psychologically devastated. It might be that every time you meet a new person, they're like, oh, you're the person in the meme, right? And like your ability to live a normal life is totally destroyed, right?
Yeah.
So call that the kind of like call that the kind of indirect effects of my disrespectful behavior. So this is a really long-winded answer, but my inclination is to think, with respect to other people, there's something problematic about me making the picture with the malevolent intention and just having it on my hard drive. Like I am expressing towards you attitudes that I shouldn't express towards another human being, maybe, right? Like the desire to imagine you in a state of being humiliated or something like that. But it seems to me like, and it seems to me like that's quite different from like, look, I've just destroyed your life by doing this thing, which then has this effect on what happens in the world, right? So this is a long-winded thing, but okay. Now suppose we imagine the same pair of cases, but instead of doing these things to you, I do this thing to like my neighbor's dog, who I have a grievance towards because they always pee on my basil, right? Now it seems to me that if I make the humiliating picture of my neighbor's dog and I keep it on my hard drive, that shows something problematic about my character. But I don't think that I have wrongfully disrespected the dog. I like it feels to me like the dog is not the kind of thing that could like we can kind of imagine like looking me in the eye and being like, what, like, you are not seeing me as a real person, but rather as like a thing to be humiliated in this way, right? That doesn't seem plausible to me. On the other hand, if like the publicizing of the picture, if then like for some reason the dog's life becomes dangerous because everybody is like always trying to kidnap the dog and like recreate the photoshopped photo in real life, then I've had a really negative impact on the life of the dog. Okay.
Yeah, right.
So, okay. So this is an incredibly long-winded answer. I really apologize to everyone who's trying to follow along. What did this have to do with going into the dumpster and eating the thrown away fried chicken? Okay, let me try to spell this out now. Let me try to make the connection. Okay. If we were living in a kind of vegan utopia, Freeganism would be more or less impossible, right? We're not living in a kind of vegan utopia. We're living in a world in which overwhelmingly people simply take for granted that it's okay to use animal flesh, right? Because of that, if somebody sees me retrieving the fried chicken from the dumpster and then eating it, thereby expressing my willingness to consume the flesh of a dead non-human animal, I'm unlikely to have the second kind of effect that I was describing, the sort of just instrumentally changing how the world is in a way that's worse for the non-human animals. Just because like we're working against a background where people already take it for granted that it's okay to eat non-human animal flesh, overwhelmingly. Like overwhelmingly people take that for granted. And so then it seems to me that if Freeganism is going to be objectionable on respect grounds, it has to be on the kind of intrinsic respect grounds. But I just like, there are some non-human animals who seem to have like attitudes towards their dead. Elephants are famously an example of this, right? There's probably others. But I'm just not convinced that chickens are going to be the kinds of creatures who have attitudes towards what happens towards to their bodies after they're dead, such that I can really disrespect them. I can like do something that is problematic with respect to them by desecrating their corpse.
Gotcha.
So that's a very long-winded answer, but the sort of thought is, this is like another application of kind of the general point in the Why I'm a Vegan paper, which is I really do think of non-human animals and their ethical significance quite different from the ethical significance of most humans. It's just that it's still pretty darn important. It's not the same as the ethical significance of you or me. It's just that it's not the way that many people treat them, which is that they're more or less ignorable. So if you thought more like, no, non-human animals, the baseline way of thinking about ethics with non-human animals is like, really, they are pretty much like us for important ethical purposes. Then I think the kind of disrespect concern that you were describing would be more of a concern.
Right. So I think push back a little. I think it's briefly mentioned in the paper of where it's like, where it actually doesn't seem to depend on if the agent is the kind of being or if that individual, has a certain regard for how they should be treated after death. Think of children or marginal case humans. It still seems very off-putting to do away with the sort of dignity norms, whether it be in the US, which is like having a funeral, or burning them, incinerating them, which I feel like would seem very strange if that wasn't just a custom part of the culture I grew up in, of just burning the bodies to ashes. But that sort of things. And so it might not depend on the creature's faculties or even ability to have attitudes towards how they're treated after they die. What would you say about that?
So, so I want to be careful here. So I don't think it necessarily depends on the individual's attitudes. So, for example, here's a
Mm-hmm.
reason why I think it doesn't depend on the person's attitudes. If there's a person who, for some reason, has bought into a kind of self-abnegating ideology where, like, it's okay to disrespect and humiliate people like me, I don't think that makes it okay to disrespect and humiliate that person.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it has to do with, as it were, the particular attitudes of the person. Okay. Um, Now, um, on the other hand, when we're thinking about norms that apply to, so this is like I think just a general and really hard part of ethics. When we're thinking about certain norms that generally apply to human beings, um, one way to think about those norms is that those norms apply to all human beings directly in virtue of a feature that all the human beings have. And I think certain norms that involve, say, suffering are kind of like this. Other norms are things where we maybe have social norms and we maybe extend them, and maybe it's good that we extend them to all human beings, but as it were, they have their explanatory home with respect to certain human beings and not others. And it's just kind of a good social practice to extend them more broadly. Let me give you an example. In general, we have these strange rules around voting, where, in general, if you're 15 years old, you can't vote. And in general, there's some age, maybe it's 16, maybe it's 18, it depends on the jurisdiction, where, like, it really doesn't matter what's going on for you, what your capacities are. If you reach that magic age, you can vote. Here would be a really bad picture of the ethics of that. There's this magical status of being an 18-year-old human, and it's just fitting that every 18-year-old human have the right to determine who is the political leadership in a democratic polity. That's just a crazy view. There's nothing intrinsically interesting about being an 18-year-old human, right? Presumably what's going on, rather, is that, look, in general, we think that by the time people are 18 years old, they have the kinds of capacities for making decisions about political topics such that we think that they can be full members of our polity. And now, of course, some people clearly don't, and some people who are 12 clearly do. But if we started going around testing and saying, oh, you're 25, but you don't make the cut, or you're 12 and you do make the cut, super bad shit's gonna happen. That's the thought is, like, very bad effects. Not because, like, like, as it were, if an all-powerful and benevolent being was instituting this process, it might be okay. But even so, it might not be okay, because if you were like the 20-year-old who just misses the cut, you might feel, again, totally humiliated, and your life might be wrecked, and it might just be better overall if, even though you're not quite there with respect to the capacities we'd like a voter to have, we'd let you vote, right? And so there's a way in which I think, for the purposes of thinking about things like voting, you shouldn't think that there's just some property that all people who are entitled to vote have that's really the ethically significant property. Really, there's this other complicated thing going on about when we have social norms around things and what it would be to exclude certain people from those social norms. Okay, so that was really long-winded. And now I'm on to the second part of the answer, because that was only the first part of the answer. So how does this bear on disrespecting non-human animals? I think respect norms towards other human beings are sort of the same way. Like, there are ways in which we want to behave respectfully. We don't want to, for example, we don't want to say, well, you shouldn't eat adult human beings, but you can eat children, right? But I don't think that's because necessarily you can disrespect a 2-year-old. I don't think you can disrespect a 2-year-old. I think the explanation for why we don't want people eating their 2-year-old children if they happen to die tragically is like bad shit might happen if we have social norms that allow that to go down. And so I'm inclined to think that the explanation isn't that there's some shared respectable property. It's rather that we extend out the norm from, as it were, its ideal home because of bad effects that would happen if we tried to make the boundaries somewhere else.
Okay.
So that's a really complicated answer, but that's sort of where I think someone who wants to defend freeganism and resist that argument should probably go.
All right. Well, I think the plan is to have Josh Milburn here in a month or so. So I will let him know that's what you said. I'll see what he's got to say about that.
I'm sure he'll have something fantastic in response. So.
All right. So I guess we're going to do a question from Dantes. Professor, I'd like to know how you ground your understanding of the ethics of veganism, as in what metaethical and normative ethical views do you ascribe to?
Awesome. So let me say the following thing. So I've given some long answers. I could talk like for all day about this. So I'm just going to say a few things, and then, we can talk more if there are related questions.
That sounds great.
Okay. So first of all, when it comes to normative ethics and applied ethics, so just so everybody follows along with the way that I'm thinking about this distinction, I'm thinking of sort of applied or practical ethics as ethical reasoning where we're trying to answer the question, to answer sort of like particular pressing questions. Should I be a vegan or not, for example? Or, what should I think about the ethics of abortion? Or, how should I ethically evaluate the Black Lives Matter movement? Something like that, right? Call those sort of questions in applied or practical ethics. When people talk sometimes about systematic normative ethics or ethical theory, often what they talk about is a kind of project that some people, especially some philosophers, have been interested in, of trying to construct a general theory that explains why acts are right or wrong. And so an example of such a general theory, not, I think, the true ethical theory, but just one that many people might have heard of, is utilitarianism, specifically act utilitarianism, which says an action is the act that you're required to perform just in case it's an act which will have better overall consequences than any of your other options. Okay. Where those consequences are understood in terms of the happiness or unhappiness of creatures capable of having happiness and unhappiness. Okay, so that's a kind of ethical theory. And the important thing about ethical theory is it's supposed to sort of explain everything. It's supposed to be the kind of thing that kind of tells you, well, if you want to think about any particular ethical topic, now, as it were, you understand the general principles that apply to all ethical questions. Okay. So some philosophers are really interested in ethical theory. Some philosophers are really interested in practical ethics. Here's a really fascinating question. How do ethical theory and practical ethics relate to each other? My view is this. Philosophy in general is very challenging. It's hard to figure out the right answers to ethical questions. One illustration of this is just how much disagreement you see amongst careful, thoughtful philosophers about all kinds of ethical questions. I think that in general, because of this, I think we're not in a particularly good position to figure out what the ideally correct ethical theory is. And so I think that the idea so there's a kind of picture that's an attractive picture you might have for doing applied ethics, which is just like figure out what the correct general ethical theory is, and then just apply it to your particular case. But I actually think that's generally not a good strategy, because I think we're very often in a much better position to think about specific ethical principles that apply in a range of cases than we are to try to figure out sort of the totality of ethics all at once. And because of that, I'm inclined to think that we can make a good argument for veganism, as I did in my paper, without appealing to a systematic ethical theory. And in fact, I think that's a better sort of more methodologically robust way of trying to argue for views in practical ethics in general. And that's good for me because just autobiographically, I don't actually know what ethical theory is correct. I'm inclined to think that there is a correct ethical theory. So I'm inclined to some sort of realism in ethics. But I just think it's really, really hard to figure out which systematic ethical theory is correct, and that it's in fact much easier to figure out answers to some questions in practical ethics. So that's already a pretty long answer. I could say much, much more, but maybe I'll just stop there for now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. All right. So Triangle here asks, in one of Bob Fischer's papers, I can't recall which, he takes aim at the idea that the wrongness of buying animals / eating animal products is grounded in the consuming agent benefiting from wrongdoing. He claims that this is too demanding for even vegans benefit from the same wrongdoing. For example, when eating in a restaurant that serves primarily meat options, the vegan eating there benefits from the wrongdoing of the animal industry, which allows for the restaurant to be economically viable. In this situation, would the vegan not be benefiting from the wrongful part of the restaurant's plan, at least in part, given that the wrongful part of the animal industry / restaurant's plan is what economically holds up the restaurant?
Awesome. So this is a place where I am inclined to change what I said in the paper. So I am now. I think there are some cases in which we can explain what you ought to do in terms of having a reason not to benefit from wrongdoing. I'm inclined to think that you can tell the whole story about veganism without appealing to any notion of benefit. Rather, like, the point is there's these social practices which are terrible for non-human animals. And you are kind of slotting yourself into those practices in ways that those practices need somebody to slot themselves into those practices in order for them to persist. And so so I am inclined to think that's probably at the end of the day the more more general thing to say is that the benefiting part is not so important, in part because, like, you might not be benefiting, right? I mean, you might in fact be, better off not having that cheeseburger.
Cholesterol.
No. And even if you are benefiting, I think in general, mere receipt of a benefit is not the kind of thing which is going to make what you're doing wrong. Very often, mere receipt of a benefit can give you some obligations. You might have obligations to try to change things, but I think that in general, it's sort of not the right kind of thing. So I think I'm sort of in principle sympathetic to what Bob Fischer says there. And I was rereading my paper today before this AMA because it's been a while since I read it. And one of the things that I noticed is that there's just some sloppiness in that paper around exactly this issue, where there are points where I make this big hullabaloo about supporting something in the very respect in which it's wrong. And then there's ways in which later on I then get much more, it's not clear that I'm sort of following my own rules. So I think that there are some sort of, it's not just that I sort of substantively changed my mind. I also think there's a little bit of internal instability in the paper around this issue.
Wow, awesome. Well, that is really great to hear. Just because that makes a whole lot more sense to me, the slotting thing, as opposed to the benefit. Because I did think that was the one thing I was kind of unsure on about the paper. I thought the suffering and killing stuff and all of that was phenomenal. A great way to provide an explanation for our intuitions and whatnot. But yeah, the benefit thing kind of tripped me up a little bit. But thinking of it in this slotting way it's brilliant. I really like that. So thanks so much for saying that.
No problem. I just want to say one follow-up thing. If you just think about the argument of the paper as well, and the case that motivates the complicity principle, this sort of racist realtor case.
Yeah.
Like one thing to notice there is it's not actually like you don't have to think of yourself as benefiting from the interaction with the realtor for it to be problematic. Like what's problematic is that you are like working with the realtor and the realtor's plan. Like, you know, even if it turns out that like falling in with the realtor's racist plan is like ultimately bad for you.
Yeah.
Or like even if you like it's not just that it's going to be bad for you, it's like you can foresee that you'd like do better by going to another realtor and you're just doing this like out of some sort of bloody minded like self-defeatingness, like still seems wrong. So like I actually think like the very case that I use to motivate the principle suggests that probably the benefiting stuff is not it, you know, I think that there are some ethical principles that connect to benefit, and there's some interesting literature about this, but I don't think it's the right way to formulate the principle in this paper.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's that makes a lot of sense with the racist realtor, which I thought is I liked that case a lot. It's pretty convincing to me.
And also based on like basically
Real
a
life.
lot of the way real estate has happened in the United States over the past 100 years. Yeah.
Exactly. All right. So John Quill asks, do we have an obligation to do activism? If not, are there any situations in which an agent is obligated to do activism?
This is an awesome question. So I have a follow-up paper. It's not really a follow-up paper. It's kind of a more general paper called The Puzzle of Inefficacy that I wrote a couple of years ago. And there I'm trying to think sort of very generally about what, and one way to sort of slot this into the discussion of veganism, and one of the very nice things that you were just saying, right? I really do think that when you're thinking about arguments for veganism, there's the argument that contemporary animal agriculture is sort of systematically engaging in wrongdoing at a very large scale. And I think that argument is just incredibly strong. And then there's an argument connecting that up to us as individuals. And I'm like quite dissatisfied with that part of the argument in the Why I'm a Vegan paper. And one of the things that I then tried to do was sort of develop a new general form of that kind of argument. Like think about like in general, we seem to sometimes have reasons connected up to these our relationships to these social practices in contexts where maybe we can't make a difference. What could explain that? And my paper, The Puzzle of Inefficacy, is about that sort of very general question. And here's a general way of thinking about the issue. You can sort of think about there being certain kinds of social patterns. And you can think about those social patterns, some social patterns having some really bad effects. And so like the social pattern that comprises animal agriculture and then people consuming products from animal agriculture is an example of a social pattern which has lots of really horrifyingly bad effects. So then you can kind of think, well, here's sort of three ways that you might be related to generally to a kind of social process. You might be kind of actively slotting yourself into the social process, like doing the kind of thing that helps that process to replicate itself, right? Call that being like positively involved. Or you might just be like, I'm going to try to detach myself from this social process. Or you might be like, I'm actively going to work against this social process. I'm going to like try to, and so engaging in activism would be an example of this kind of thing. And when you sort of look at things that way, I think there's sort of deep general questions in ethics about how much, like sort of how demanding ethics can be of us, and especially how much ethics can demand that we do things as opposed to refrain from doing things. So it seems like this is a pretty profound cut in ethics where some people, I think, are really attracted to the idea that like, if I'm just not wronging anybody else and not harming anybody else, and now notice given things that we've talked about earlier in this conversation, that might be actually like not a state any of us can be in, right? But some people I think as long as you're doing that, as long as you're there, like you've checked off the ethical boxes, you can't kind of have more ethical obligations. You can't have like positive ethical obligations to make bad things better when you're not making them worse, as it were, right? Whereas I think other people really have this sense, like if there's bad things going on and you have the ability to do something about it, like you have some kind of obligation to speak up, like, and again, think about other kinds of issues. Imagine there's, as there is, a lot of racism in our community. Is it okay if you're just like, I'm like not doing any of the racism, right? Well, maybe not. Like maybe that's not enough. Maybe like really insofar as you're going to be like a part of a community, you need to be like actively working towards making sure that your community is not racist, and so that maybe that requires some activism. So I think there's a kind of deep kind of cut there, where some people just sort of want ethics to not be demanding in that way, and to sort of say, yeah, you have that option, that would be really nice and everything, but yeah, there's a contrast between that and your kind of obligation to not bring about the bad effects or contribute to the bad effects. And I'm tempted to think that probably often we do have some kind of prima facie obligation to actively do stuff. It's not like the picture where like we just have to try to keep our hands clean is not a good picture. So that's in general where I'm sort of tempted. And then again, the issue that comes up there is there are ever so many valuable and worthwhile things that any one of us could be doing. And also like sometimes some of us just want to watch videos of dog shows and not do anything, right? And like that seems like there should be space in our lives to do that. And so one question is like, what are the, so I guess the picture that I'm tempted towards is a picture where all of us have some kind of prima facie obligation to be involved in sort of actively bringing about sort of change in these relevant ways. But like, given how much there are things that each of us has a prima facie obligation to do, there can be, I think, real questions about like whether those obligations get defeated just because of like how much there is on each of our plates. And I think that's a really hard question where I'm tempted to think that we have some leeway, but I'm also worried that that's a view that I have because it's just such a convenient view to have.
Right, a lot easier. Gotcha. Well, thanks so much. Got a question from Stove. Hi, Professor. I was wondering, what is the distinction between moderate veganism you advocate for and the more typical veganism with the idea of practicable and possible, or simply ought implies can?
Awesome. So the differences that I think of between moderate veganism and at least what I think of as being like close to a dictionary definition of veganism or something like that.
Like a Gary Francione veganism.
Is like, so first of all, I just want to say that there are individuals who, given their circumstances, can be eating animal products, and there's nothing particularly wrong with what they're doing. Let me give you what strikes me as a kind of paradigm example of this. If there is a family living in sub-Saharan Africa, and they are, comparatively speaking, wealthy enough that they are able to acquire and care for a cow, and then consume the dairy products from that cow, and they're going to keep that cow along for a long time, given their incentive structure, et cetera. I'm inclined to think that it's okay for them to be doing that, just because like literally the like ability to provide nutritious food for their children if they're otherwise subsistence agriculturalists is such a huge deal, right? That's a really big thing that they're able to do that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. Whereas like I can provide healthy food to my child without having to consume any animal products. And so I think like one of the ways in which modest ethical veganism is modest is it says there are some situations in which the prima facie obligation to be vegan is defeated. Whereas I think of a sort of more immodest veganism as saying, no, you got to do this in the same way that you might be like, just like you can never kill a person. Similarly, you can never eat a non-human animal. So that's the first way. The second way is that I'm inclined. There are certain non-human animals in the same way that we talked about plants, and I'm not that worried about killing plants. There are certain non-human animals I'm not at all concerned about ending their lives, and I don't intentionally go around eating them. But like, if a mosquito lands on my arm, I'm going to swat it. And I just sort of think like insects with really, really basic neurological structures, I'm inclined to think there's nothing that it's like to be them. They can't suffer. And in light of that, I think they're not the kinds of creatures that we need to worry about in the relevant sense. And so, I mentioned in the paper, seems to me probably on the kind of argument that I offer, it's probably totally okay to eat oysters. I don't, in fact, myself eat oysters, but it doesn't seem to me that like the kind of argument that I offer in this paper explains why you shouldn't eat oysters. The two ways in which it's moderate, one is like it's not actually all animals, and the other is there are going to be certain kinds of considerations where I think it is in fact okay to eat animals.
Gotcha. Yeah. Fantastic. So we got about 3 questions that are like sort of activism based. So I'm going to combo them into one.
Whoa, okay.
All right. So basically we got what would cause the majority of people to go vegan, and what are the most crucial components for effective communications with non-vegans for, optimal effects? And then how would you bring up a conversation to a family or friend where they're in a situation where it's going to be really hard for them to go vegan due to a complex situation? Maybe they're like 14 in school or whatever, and their family is non-vegan.
Awesome.
So most effective ways, and then what if it's hard?
Yep. Okay. So let me say a few different things. And first of all, one of the general caveat, these kinds of questions I think I am not well professionally qualified for, right? And I'm not actually sure who is really professionally well qualified to answer these kinds of questions. I mean, questions about how do you change the hearts and minds of people? Like these are questions that political strategists and advertisers are constantly thinking about. And it turns out that even so, we're not that reliable. Even those people are not that reliable. Think of all the terrible ad campaigns that don't in fact help their products, right? So with that being said, I think that one of I think there probably realistically has to be a kind of process. One thing that I have friends who live in the United Kingdom, and they say just over the past 10 years, there's been a kind of sea change of just the availability, vegan products are available everywhere. Every restaurant has good vegan options. This might be something of an exaggeration, but sort of there's a kind of a felt contrast between going from being a kind of sort of wasteland for veganism to being a place where it's really central and prominent. And I expect it's a combination of a bunch of stuff. I expect if you want to do this kind of thing, part of what you need to do is stuff that I am professionally disqualified from, helping to try to make it feel cool, that kind of stuff. But one thing I want to say is, I'm constantly fascinated by people who I know experimenting with things in their diet. And they're I've read this stuff on social media or whatever, I'm going to try to not eat any wheat for a while, or I'm going to try to, do this or do that, or I'm going to eat nothing but protein. And these are changes in people's diets that are more radical than veganism, in my opinion. Like they're like really,
Definitely.
I mean, maybe not going without wheat, but like it is like similarly challenging, I think. Um, and I think people are like many people are willing to try a lot of this stuff out, and I think realistically what has to happen is you need to create a sort of an ecosystem where there's like these kinds of options and it's easy for people to try stuff out, and then you need to sort of create a situation in which a lot of people are like, okay, like I'm eating vegan a lot, like would I really miss it to go vegan, completely. And I think that's really important. I mean, I know a number of people who, and this is especially and disturbingly common amongst philosophers, who are like, I really think that I ought to be vegan, and I'm just not. And it just
Yeah.
feels like too much for them, right? And so I think like making it easier is a big deal. But also like not just making it easier, but like making it more fun and making it like more decadent. One of the things I'm really struck
Mhm.
by, I'm a big cookbook person. Like I really like reading cookbooks, and like the
Me too.
transition of vegan cookbooks over the past 25 years has been unbelievable. Like 25
Yeah.
years ago, a vegan cookbook was like, it's all this like super healthy food, and and now you like get these cookbooks that are like vegan food that will harden your arteries in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And like you're like, whoa, okay, and it's the same thing with restaurants. You have like now like lots of like incredibly unhealthy vegan restaurants. I have like
Mhm.
mixed feelings about that because I would prefer not to eat a lot of unhealthy food, but I think it's
Yeah.
part of making veganism sort of feel like not like some weird ascetic practice, but like this is a way that you can like be fun with food and enjoy it, and like
Mhm.
have like a sort of aesthetically and ethically feel good experience around your food. So I think that's part of it. And then I think at some point when it's at some point when you're thinking about then trying to get to like the promised land of a world that's more vegan, I think I think once you have to hope that we sort of reach a situation with veganism that we reached with cigarettes, where like
Mhm.
at some point it just starts to become like, ooh, like why are you eating that cheeseburger? Like
Right.
people go off to their special little cheeseburger places to eat them, and no one else wants to be around them while they do that.
Right.
But I think like that's if that ever happens, that's like very far in the future. So,
Mhm.
the last question about like how do you advise like the 14-year-old who wants to be vegan and their family is like being super uncooperative, and like um, that is a really hard question. And the thing that I would say to that kind of person if I was talking to them is, you know, first of all, if you can't be vegan because of facts about your situation, if living with your family puts you in a situation which is functionally like, being the farmer in sub-Saharan Africa, where like, you just don't have these options that are acceptable options.
Mhm.
So first of all, like, don't beat yourself up over it, right? But second of all, like, try to take steps where, learn how to be, where you have the options, learn how to be a vegan. I mean, one of the things I think that uh, is really important is I think some people are just like, right, I'm going to be vegan, and then like their picture of what veganism is like they have their traditional like meal, and then they take the steak out of the middle of it, and then like
Yep.
what's going on, right? And so I think it's learning about foods, learning about like preparing foods and making them yummy, and if you're prepared to do that, and especially if you're prepared to do that where you have those options, at some point the 14-year-old's going to be a few years older and is going to be able to make these choices for themselves.
Mhm.
And then if they've built up these skills, they're going to be able to be a vegan who feels great about their veganism, and who other people look at the food that they bring to lunch and are like, wow, and
Mhm.
help to convert other people. And so the one thing I would say is like, don't beat yourself up about this because it's if it's not possible, but like try to build the skills and the tools such that you can be an ambassador for veganism even if you're not able to be a vegan yourself.
All right. Thanks so much. So
And also, if you're a parent and your kid's trying out being, be patient and supportive, even if you're not there yourself.
mhm. So, speaking of like the making everything easy, are you familiar with something called plant-based capitalism?
I don't think I am. But tell me more about plant-based capitalism.
Well, yeah, I think it's more of an online thing than in an academic setting. But basically, to my understanding of it, there's a group of people who oppose, for example, the brand Morningstar, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and the brands like Field Roast. Morningstar because some of their products have eggs, and Field Roast because they're owned by a Canadian meat and cheese company.
Yep.
And these people say it's totally wrong to consume these products. They're also against Beyond Burgers and Impossible Burgers and whatnot. And what do you think about that?
So what do I think about that? I'm tempted to think when you're thinking about kind of opposition to those kinds of companies, and specifically opposition to those companies that involves like boycotting their vegan products, for example, I do think things are a little bit complicated, right? Because on the one hand, you might have like very legitimate grievances about these companies, because of the way that they engage in industrialized agriculture, because of the way that they make animal products in other contexts, et cetera. And so that certainly, so then if you like have the option to support other kinds of companies, I think that could very well make sense. On the other hand, so to the extent that there's an other hand, I think the other hand is this. I think that this comes back to the kind of previous question about how do we like get more people on the vegan bandwagon. I think there's a lot to be said for people feeling like there's a lot of vegan options. And so I think there's a cost if, vegans successfully rally against these products and like, these kinds of companies go, stop making them, and the sort of ecosystem of vegan products becomes less interesting. I think that's a cost. And there's also a cost, I think, if people feel like, oh man, here I am thinking about being, trying out veganism, but it turns out like it's not enough to just be vegan. I've also got to like make sure I get my vegan products from like only the following 7 approved companies or something. So like I think you want to make sure that you don't create a situation where it just kind of feels like you're making this lifestyle, which already at the front end is going to feel like a very demanding transition to many people. You want to make it feel like you can transition to this, and maybe it takes you a while to transition to this, and it's okay if it takes you a while. Not like if you are doing anything other than like maximal veganism, like your life is a failure. So I think so I think that's the thing to be said against it, which is I know a lot of people who are vegetarian who are like or like often vegetarian, or like some sort of category like that, like they don't eat very many animal products. And I know like some of these kinds of products that have been mentioned in this question, they're like a big part of helping them to lead a much more plant-based lifestyle. And so the thing that I would be worried about is like making them feel somehow like, oh, like that's not enough, and so now and then like just feeling like it's all too hard.
Right. I definitely agree. I mean, literally, yeah.
But that's not to say that there might be really important activist work to be done to campaign against these companies when they're behaving poorly.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, personal life, my girlfriend's best friend just moved an apartment like above us, and she's been eating all kinds of vegan products now. Like she was eating Oatly ice cream the other day, and she was like, "Oh, but I can never give up grilled cheese because there's no American cheese that's vegan." And we were like, "Oh, well, here's a slice of vegan American cheese." Yep. And people like that, and she's like a very picky eater. Really hard to change. I got another friend who only eats Smart Dogs now instead of regular hot dogs because he's like, they're good enough. Yep. And I'm just, I worry all of these tiny little, little successes I've had in my day-to-day life, it's just gone because because we don't want these non-vegan companies producing vegan stuff.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just say like one other thing, which again like takes us back to the paper, which is that if you're you got to think about all the different companies who were involved, right? So if you go to your local big box grocery store, like they've got a meat department, right? But and so I'm not sure like if buying the product that's produced by the company that also produces the animal products, is that different from buying the product from the grocery store that also stocks those products? And so so I think like and so one worry is like being consistently trying to like have a sort of really exclusivist sort of, we're not going to deal with any companies who are not behaving well sort of attitude might just be like way too demanding. That might be, and so that's a place where I just like to sort of think through how that's all going to go. If that makes sense.
Gotcha. All right. So I think we're going to be closing things out here shortly. Just a couple more questions. So one is, many lay people often dismiss vegan activism, i.e. just the act of prescribing ethical veganism to others, as a form of annoying moralism. What, if anything, is irrational or problematic about this?
Yeah. So, this is an interesting kind of question because I do think this is a kind of reaction that you hear sometimes. You have like, oh well, like you've just cherry picked this one thing, and partly, part of my reaction to that is like it feels like it's grounded in like not taking the kind of ethical basis of the view seriously enough. Like it feels like it would be a very weird view to be like, oh yeah, you're just kind of like engaged in this, you're doing like some sort of weird virtue signaling thing or something. Like it would be weird to have that view and also be like animal agriculture is like one of the great ethical catastrophes of our time. Like that would be a weird combination of views. And so partly I think the mistake of this kind of view involves not taking the underlying problem seriously enough. And I kind of like, if you think about kind of some people's dismissive reaction to sort of climate activists, I sort of feel a similar kind of thing. Like, no, like this is this is possibly in the case of climate change, like the most existentially important ethical question of our time. Like, yeah, like you're allowed to get a little intense about it. And so I think that's kind of part of it. I mean, another part, like it's going to depend on from case to case, but I do think this kind of reaction is a very natural kind of defensive reaction. And I do think that one of the things about veganism is that it is a case where a lot of people see that there's something prima facie to be said for this. And then when you see somebody living something where you kind of feel like, yeah, there's kind of something to be said for that, but you're not there yet yourself, it's very natural for that to trigger a kind of defensiveness, right? But then the last thing I guess I'll say is, like this is especially going to be true depending on how, as a vegan, you interact with other people. If, your like opening move is like, so you realize that you were like, you were an awful person who's like basically responsible for contributing to something that's basically like the Holocaust except for animals. Like that's maybe not like the best opening move.
Yeah.
Right. And so I do think like part of my attitude towards being vegan and towards talking about veganism is I want to be like totally respectful of people who are not vegan and just like let's have a conversation about why you're not there. I have learned a tremendous amount about the arguments talking to people who are not convinced by the arguments and who are not vegan. And I think that's really valuable because I think ultimately we want to like figure out what the best arguments are.
Mm-hmm.
And, I just think, and I've also learned a lot from talking to people where it's not about the arguments, but they just can't make themselves like they're not ready to do that in their life. And I think that's also really interesting. And so I just
Mm-hmm.
think like, you know, part of what we can do as vegans is like make people not feel like our very presence is like a deep criticism of their life.
Mm-hmm.
And even so, people are going to be defensive because we're kind of primed. Seems like, especially in this time of social media, we are like primed to like feel like we have to be on a side and like pick
Mm-hmm.
fights. And that defensiveness is going to happen, and it's unfortunate. And that's, in some cases, if you're in an especially inhospitable social environment, it can be like hostile and scary. But like that is like part of what you need to navigate as a vegan.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks so
All
much.
right, that was a bit of a downer note there.
Yeah, all good, all good. So I want to ask you a question about wild animal suffering.
Yep.
And I guess we could also talk about hunting here. What sort of responsibilities do you think that we have regarding wild animals? And then do you think we should be allowed to say kill invasive species, or like I'm sure you hear the deer hunters all the time being like, oh, they'll like overpopulate, so it's good. We need to kill them actually, that sort of stuff. And then also, how do you feel about predators in the wild? Killing and eating other animals. And is there anything we can do about that?
Awesome. Okay, so this is a really hard question, and I don't think I have really settled. Well, it's actually a collection of questions, and I don't think I have really settled things to say about it. But I'll say a few things. One thing that I want to that I sort of structures my thinking about this is we have a really bad track record of like we know how to manage these like non-human ecological structures. And so one thing I sort of worry about in the kind of like, we're going to be culling these creatures because we know what we need to do to make this a stable ecosystem kind of strategy is like, just for practical purposes, like what's our track record like on that front? How are we doing there?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the answer is not very good. So that's one thing I want to say about this. I think that in some kind of incredibly ideal world, we would have to ask these questions much more seriously. Like if we had like really much more control and much more singularity of purpose as human beings, and also like much more understanding of what's going on in these non-human environments. I'm inclined to think that in those kinds of situations, some kinds of, culling of herds in order to prevent certain kinds of catastrophes, et cetera, might be strategies that are acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's going to be like the difficulties in knowing exactly where we are is going to be quite profound.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to predation, I think I have similar sort of thoughts. I think this is like, for practical purposes, an incredibly hard. Well, in a certain sense, for practical purposes, I think it's not hard at all. Namely, we don't have the resources to create stable ecosystems without predators in them for many kinds of species. And so the idea that we would be like trying to prevent the predation from happening, like then what are you going to do? Are you going to like sterilize, if you're going to like get rid of all the wolves, are you then going to sterilize all the deer so that they don't get, overpopulated? And like, we're just like, we're nowhere near in that kind of situation, but like maybe at some point in the future we are. And maybe like a kind of future in which like we know which proportion of the deer to sterilize in a certain ecosystem, and there are no wolves, and so the deer in general live much longer and better deer lives as a result. Maybe that's the best overall possibility. I don't want to discount that. Um, and so one sort of more general sort of slogany thing that this brings out about my ethical thinking is that I'm not impressed by the thought that there's something sort of intrinsically important about the preservation of wildness. But that doesn't mean that there isn't something really, for practical purposes, important about like hands off and preservation of wildness, because like we are not, as a matter of fact, either like ideally in a position to manage non-human species, and even if we were in a position in terms of knowledge and technology, like we don't have the will to do it well. We're going to do it in some screwed up way, given the like in fact human values with respect to non-human animals. So I think that like for practical purposes, I am tempted to a kind of, as much as possible, hands off the natural environment kind of picture. But that's not because I think like that's sort of intrinsically super valuable. It's just that I think the chances that we're going to make things worse rather than better is often pretty high.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks so much. So this is a quick one. Do you have a superior plant-based milk and superior bean?
By superior, like,
what is your favorite? yeah. What is the best one?
Oh man. So I wind up, when I can get it, it's sort of oddly hard to acquire at the grocery store. Like this is another one of these cases where I think like ideally I would make my own plant-based milks, but like too many other things going on for me to make that a priority, it seems. I really like this, like, think it's called like, it's like silk protein nut milk or something. So it's made with a combination of almond and cashew milk with like a bunch of pea protein added to it.
Oh,
so it has
20 grams of protein like per serving?
It's not, I think there's a version of it that's like super bulked up, but this just has like the same amount of protein per serving as like soy milk or cow milk.
Gotcha.
And so basically, I feel like when I have this stuff on my cereal or I use it in my cooking, first of all, it seems to cook a little better for baking purposes, I find, than like soy milk. It makes things less heavy for whatever reason. But also, I just find like I eat a lot of soy already, so it's just kind of diversifying my protein sources a little bit. And I also think it's, as the nut milks go, pretty tasty, and it's not just like I'm drinking flavored water. So that's generally where I go if I can find it. As far as a sort of favored like bean, wow. I'm probably calorie per calorie, I eat a ton of tofu, so probably like soy is the thing that I have the most, is my largest protein source. I'm huge into chickpeas though, like eat a lot of chickpeas a lot of different ways. And then, I also eat a lot of black beans. So those soy, chickpeas, and black beans are probably my three sort of most go-to.
Gotcha. All right, fantastic. So, briefly dipping into meta-ethics, what do you think? And so, if you wouldn't mind keeping this one a little shorter, just because I would love to talk to you for hours about this, but
another time. But yeah,
right. But so, what do you think the biggest challenge is to contemporary accounts of naturalistic moral realism?
If I wanted to sort of put it in a slogan, I think there's a lot of different kinds of accounts, different kinds of problems, but I really think probably the biggest one is different, and that this sort of manifests in different ways, but I think there's a general kind of feeling that many people have, and that sort of seems vindicated in many cases, that kind of the sort of significance of ethical properties as evaluative properties, as things which are suitable to guide our lives, seems like it becomes elusive or gets lost on a naturalistic picture. And I think trying to explain how it is that you sort of preserve that kind of evaluative character, and not just some sort of weak simulacrum of it, but like the kind of evaluative character that it really seems to a normative realist or to an ethical realist, like that the ethical stuff has. I think that's I think various forms of that are kind of like the number one challenge for the naturalist.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. So how, and this is from Episky, how important is the consideration of intersectional differences between individuals within vegan activism? What do we need to be careful / sensitive about?
So this is a huge issue. And again, I'm going to say some general things. And part of the reason why I'm going to say some general things is that I think probably like I'm not the best person to talk in an authoritative way about this issue. Here's just a general thing which I think seems to be true about human beings, which is that very often what you have is you have a kind of intersectional dynamic in social movements. And by an intersectional dynamic, what I mean is this: if you have a social movement that's organized around gender, very often it's the people who are privileged along other dimensions, people who are, say, white and upper middle class and not disabled, right? Those seem to be the people who like are at the center of that activist community, and very often their being at the center of that activist community informs like how they imagine the problem, and it informs like who they are trying to reach and talk to, and like who they're trying to coordinate with. And sometimes like it creates all kinds of other kinds of problems, right? I mean, famously, you know, you have like the sort of the like genre of kind of like sort of very dubious from a feminist perspective advertising campaigns for various kinds of animal rights causes, you know, this kind of thing. And it's like, you know, I don't think that kind of stuff does anybody any favors.
Yeah.
And so I think even just from a like practical trying to like move our project forward kind of perspective, it's really important to think about how are we including different people's voices? Are those people being made welcome? Are they being sort of invited to the center of the conversation, et cetera? How do we make how do we make connections with other kinds of like important political projects where we think that there's some sort of common ground to be made? You know, so I think those are all really important sort of questions to ask and sort of projects to pursue. But as I say, like I'm probably not the best person to speak to that, just because I'm a super privileged white dude. And so like a lot of the concrete facts on the ground about how that matters are things that are going to be harder for me to see than for someone in a different social position.
Gotcha. All right. So this next question is actually going to be asked by my friend Isaiah.
All right.
Isaiah, you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Awesome. Okay. So I have a few questions that kind of go together.
Okay.
So I read that you're a fan of the board game Go.
Yep.
So my first question is, what is it the grounds? I guess I should probably ask all of the questions because it might kind of like inform, like the later questions might inform how you're going to answer the earlier questions.
Sure.
But so what is it that grounds being a moral patient? Is it purely phenomenal consciousness or something else? And my second question is, do you think that AlphaGo, which is the AI system created by Google that beat Lee Sedol at Go, should be treated as a moral patient, at least in virtue of it being a moral hazard to destroy it or more modern machine learning systems? And then my third question is, when, if ever, will you say that AI should be treated as moral patients to the extent that there might be a vegan style movement for AIs, especially given the fact that we might not actually know at what point they like have actually become conscious?
Awesome. So those are great questions. Remind me of the first question. I think I've got the second and third one in mind, but the first one somehow slipped out.
Yeah. So the first one is, what is it that grounds moral patiency? Is it just
Wow.
like phenomenal consciousness?
Okay, so I'm inclined to think that phenomenal consciousness is probably sufficient. I'm not sure it's necessary, um, because I think that, so this is going to be something which for the non-philosophers in the audience might be going a little far afield, but there's a philosopher named David Chalmers who like imagines the possibility of what he calls phenomenal zombies, which are creatures who are basically functionally exactly like us. They go throughout their, they have meat sacks like we do. They go throughout their days. They perform behaviors that are indistinguishable from our behaviors, etc. But there's just nothing that it's like to be them. Now, it might be absolutely impossible for there to be such creatures, but one possibility that I take seriously is that a certain level of functional sophistication, even without, as it were, phenomenal consciousness being involved, might be sufficient for being a moral patient and also for being a moral agent. So one thing that I'm tempted by actually is to go via moral agency. So I'm tempted to think that a sufficiently sophisticated non-phenomenally conscious system could be a moral agent. That is, it could be sensitive enough to various kinds of feedback that it could make sense to hold it accountable in various ways, that we hold other moral agents accountable. And I'm tempted to think that because they're moral agents, such entities are also going to count as moral patients. But I'm not sure. Like, these are very hard questions. Okay. So this kind of dovetails a little bit into the second and third parts of the questions, and I'll sort of do those in the reverse order. So the third question was like, how will we know when we have AI systems that are basically suitable to be moral patients? And I think probably it's like because it's so hard to know how these things, what exactly it takes for the grounds for moral patiency. Probably it's going to happen before we know it happens. And so one thing I think is that we should have a kind of precautionary attitude here. In the same way as in my argument for ethical veganism, part of what I say is like there's a range of creatures where it's going to be controversial whether there's anything that it's like to be those creatures. And there, I think probably our attitude towards those creatures should be precautionary. We should be like, well, maybe there's something that is like for those creatures to exist, and maybe they can suffer. And in light of that, we should treat them accordingly. And I think similar things are going to potentially happen with AI. Things are very tricky with AI. I am not an expert on the topic of like where we are with AI cognition, but I'm a kind of interested amateur. And I think that one of the things that's happened is that there have been extraordinary advances in neural networks recently, especially sort of neural network-based AIs recently, that have enabled AI to do all kinds of super fantastically interesting things, such as be better than any human player at Go, which was something which a few years ago people thought was like going to take a long time before AI were able to do that, and then AlphaGo just did it. And now I have such an AI on my phone. It's like a very short transition there. Now, I think that there's a really big cut, however, between a system within being able to have a neural network which can get trained up on a data set such that it can perform superbly at a task like playing Go, and like having something that is basically agent-like or has a perspective. I think those are like quite different things. And so part of me thinks that we could still be very far away from having agent-like AI. And different people have different views about this. Like maybe we need to create the AI so they're more embodied and interact with their environment like we do. I'm not sure. Like, this is not my area of expertise. But I do think that all the way along, we should be having a super precautionary attitude. We should be thinking, if there starts to be reasonable controversy about whether one of these entities is conscious or sentient or an agent in a meaningful sense, then we ought to start sort of treating those entities as if they have the relevant kinds of statuses, or at least as if they might, and protecting them from various kinds of harm, like just deciding to discontinue their existence because we're not interested in that research project anymore. So that's sort of my general stance, which is like, I suspect we're farther away from that than you might initially think, but I think that it's probably going to happen at some point if we don't destroy ourselves first, and we should have a precautionary attitude towards it, and make sure that we don't mistreat a bunch of agent-like, a bunch of genuinely agential or morally patient AIs. Maybe I'll stop there. Are there follow-up questions? That was a lot.
Yeah, that was good. I appreciate you answering the question.
All right, you're very welcome.
All right, well, thank you, Zaya. We're going to shoot you back to the audience. And all right, we're not going to keep you much longer. Just one last question,
Awesome.
which is, what are some papers and books on veganism-related topics or various academics, philosophers that you'd recommend? And then also, what are some of your favorite works in philosophy in general?
Oof. Wow. This, I think, is a hard question. I should have prepared more for this question. So I think this probably going to like depend on, so like if I'm going to like make recommendations, I'm often going to be like very sensitive to audience. Some of the people who you've already had on these AMAs are people who I think are doing some of the best work around this kind of issue. Like I think Bob Fischer is doing great work, just to pick somebody who I sometimes disagree with, but I think is fantastic. So sort of around veganism stuff, I think that, yeah, there's a bunch of things going on, and I feel like there's actually enough of it going on that I'm kind of hesitant to make particular recommendations because I feel like I'm actually like a little behind the curve right now. But that would be sort of one person. More generally in philosophy, I think if you're somebody who's not a philosopher, but you're like, hey, I'm interested in, like poking my, taking a look at sort of some philosophy stuff. I think probably the two philosophers who I would kind of recommend as starting points are Peter Singer, because Peter Singer is just, has talked about issues that are connected to animals really powerfully, and is also generally like somebody who has a gift for writing in a relatively accessible way. And then let's see. Oh man, my mind is blanking. I have the most terrible name aphasia sometimes, where I'm just like thinking about a person and then my mind goes completely blank. That is very vicious. That is
like
very
Tom
embarrassing.
Regan,
So I'm not a huge Tom Regan fan, I have to say. I think it's important that those ideas are out there. One person whose work in practical ethics I have a lot of admiration for, but who is doing I think mostly sort of more technical stuff these days is Mark Badolfson. I think they're pretty great. But yeah, and then more generally in terms of philosophers, somebody who's sort of had a lot of impact on my thinking in recent years has been Sally Haslanger. She's definitely somebody who I've spent a lot of time thinking about. In part because she was actually pretty instrumental in getting me to start thinking about the sort of questions about kind of reevaluating our own concepts around sort of social and political and ethical concepts, and that's been a really central part of my thinking in recent years. Yeah, so maybe I'll stop there. There's lots of other philosophers who I could name check, but yeah, I sort of feel like I'll name those few people, and there's lots of other people who I have a lot of admiration for. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. Could not thank you more. It's been so fun. Great way to spend my afternoon, I think. And I hope it wasn't too painful for you.
No, it's been awesome. And I really appreciated all the questions. I wish very often I had more like pithy and decisive answers to these questions. Often I'm just kind of like, well, things are complicated. Here's some stuff. But that's often, I think, where I'm at with some of these issues. So.
Yep, you decided to study ethics. That's your
Yep.
that's your consequence. All right. Well, is there anything you want to like shout out? Like any upcoming works or anything we should be on the look for?
Goodness. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess like one place where I want to go in my research in the next year or two, just a thing that some people, the very philosophically minded among you, might be interested in. One of the things I have been interested over the past couple of years, especially in work that I've co-authored with the philosopher David Plunkett, I've been sort of increasingly interested in questions about whether we might evaluate our own ethical concepts and think about alternatives to them. And I am starting to think, one of the big questions I'm interested in is questions about how we as individuals relate to these large-scale social processes. And one of the things that I'm hoping to write a paper about in the near future is a paper sort of thinking about that, not in as a question in ethics in the ordinary sense, but as a question about, given sort of existential threats to humanity of various kinds, like what kinds of ethical-ish concepts should we be using as concepts to be guiding our reasoning around these questions, where I think of that as a different kind of question. So that's maybe a kind of a thing to look for in my future, at least.
All right. Well, thanks so much. Won't keep you any longer, but take care, and I'll close the stage out now.
All right. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for making this happen.